Ghost Horror Story, Ghost District. Author, No Fi. I have a friend named Hung. We have known each other for more than 10 years. Occasionally, I go to his house in Kinjio to visit on holidays or weekends. Everyone knows that Kinjio is a district of the city, and also a famous tourist area. But this time is different. This time I don't have to go to Hung's house on a weekend or any holiday, but on a normal day for a very normal reason. Hello, Hung. Can I ask you a favor? Yes, can you tell me? Hung spoke calmly. Yes, I plan to stay at your house for about 1 or 2 weeks. Is it possible? Hung replied with a surprised voice. No big deal. But why do you intend to stay so long? Normally you only play for 1 day and then go back to Saigon in the afternoon. I said sadly over the phone. I got dumped by my boyfriend, so sad. Go home and play to relax, but here I keep missing her so much, I can't do anything. After hearing this, Hung immediately said, Yes, go home. Come back here and I'll take you out here and there to relieve your sadness. It's almost time for the full moon festival in August. This full moon festival is a big festival. People here celebrate this festival as the biggest festival of the year. Who knows, maybe you'll find someone better when you come back. Hung comforted me with his familiar cheerful voice, making me feel happy. So I told him I would come back tomorrow morning. That night, I packed some clothes and necessary items into a backpack and went to bed to wake up early to leave tomorrow morning. Early in the morning, the alarm bell rang loudly. I sat up, stretched, yawned, then took a shower, changed clothes, picked up my backpack and left the house. At 4 a.m., the air was still foggy so it was cold, the streets were deserted so I soon arrived at the Bin Khan ferry. Ferries at this time were still sparse, there were only a few people waiting for the ferry like me and a few street vendors nearby. Suddenly, a woman who was probably around 40 years old walked by, looked at me, sat down right next to me and said, Is your brother going to Kinjio to play? A bit surprised, but I politely replied, Yes, I'm coming to visit too. She didn't say anything but kept looking at my face, then said mysteriously, You should go back. You can wait until this month passes and then come back to play. I couldn't understand why a strange lady came from nowhere and asked me to come back, so I looked a bit uncomfortable. What's wrong, sister? She shook her head, sighed, then stood up and left. My face was confused and I didn't understand anything. I mumbled. What is wrong with this grandmother? It's just this morning and I'm already feeling unlucky. I waited a few more minutes for the ferry to arrive. I drove down and sat watching the ferry carrying me slowly pull away. The cool river breeze made my spirit feel lighter again, and after about 15 minutes I reached the other side. I ran for about 15 minutes then left the residential area and reached Rung Sak Street. Sak Forest is also known as mangrove forest because it includes many mangrove trees, mainly fish sauce trees and mangrove trees and some other trees, forming an array of vegetation several tens of thousands of hectares wide. I had to run more than 60 kilometers to get through the forest to get to the center of Kinjio. The sky was still dark, the road was long, looking back and forth, I was alone, making me feel a bit cold. There are only trees on both sides of the road. Every once in a while, a few kilometers away, we can see the light of a house peeking through the forest. I remember Hung once said, in his neighborhood, there used to be a man named Seven who used to transport seafood to sell in the city. That day, because the customer was so rushed, he left early to deliver it to them on time. While running smoothly, he saw a girl on the side of the road waving for a ride. She was wearing normal jeans and a shirt, and her face was rosy and pretty, so Mr. 7 pitied him and agreed to help. She said her house was in the forest and she had to go to Saigon urgently, but her car broke down, so she left it at home and walked to the main road to ask for a ride. As soon as she climbed into the car, I don't know if it was accidental or intentional, but she sat very close to Mr. 7. Her big soul kept rubbing against him, making Mr. 7 so flustered that he forgot everything. Just after running a little, she said she forgot important papers at home, so she asked Mr. 7 to go back to the car to get them. Mr. 7 was not happy because he was about to find out the beauty's house, so he turned the car and ran in the direction she pointed. After running for a long time, zigzagging along the trail, she suddenly stopped and told me to stop. Mr. 7 looked and saw that there was indeed a small, dark house tucked into another small alley. She climbed down and went inside the house while Mr. 7 stood outside waiting. After waiting for nearly 15 minutes, he didn't see her come out, so he urged her because he was about to be late. If he didn't leave immediately, he wouldn't be able to deliver the seafood on time. Called several times but did not see her answer, so Mr. 7 curiously parked the car and ran to see. When he caught fire, the house was empty, no people or furniture, dust and trash everywhere. Looking behind, there was a whole grave lying in front of me. While he was shaking like a leaf, a cold arm wrapped around Mr. 7's waist. He turned around and saw his entire pale white face, his eyes poking out, blood red, looking at him smiling affectionately. Mr. 7 was so scared that he fainted on the spot. The next morning, some forest guards found Mr. 7 lying 2 kilometers from the main road, but for some reason he could drive in because the trail leading there was just a dirt road built up by the people there. You can walk but cannot drive in. The grave belongs to a girl who died during the resistance war against the Americans. Because they didn't know who she was, they built her a grave right where she died and left it there until now. As I drove, I remembered the story Hung told me and my goosebumps kept rising. Just thinking about the car breaking down or having a broken wheel was enough to scare me. Why am I so stupid? Now I can just stay home and sleep a little more until morning and then go. I blamed myself, then turned the accelerator and accelerated to quickly leave this scary road. Luckily, I finally ran out of the forest road peacefully. Run across another bridge and you will reach the residential area. At this time, it is almost dawn, the sun comes out and radiates a red color. Sporadically on the sea surface there are a few fishing boats gliding, long shadows on the surface. Water. It's been a long time since I've seen a sunrise, it's so beautiful and relaxing. Running another 10 minutes, I arrived at Dong Hoa Commune, Hung's house. As soon as I parked the car, my mother immediately recognized me. Did you just come down to play? Coming down so early, you probably haven't had breakfast yet, right? Leave the car alone, let's go make a bowl of beef noodle soup for breakfast. I waited for an hour and then went to the table to sit down. Hung's house sells breakfast, sometimes beef noodles, rice noodles, and broken rice. As soon as he sat down, Hung appeared. He went to collect a bowl for his mother to return home. When he saw the evening, he laughed hysterically. "Hello my friend, just arrived. Bring your things into the house and then go out for breakfast." He took me inside to put my things away and then came back out. Then he asked about me and my lover, and I honestly told him everything. Then he patted his shoulder and smiled and said, Don't be sad, stay here with me whenever you want. My house is very hospitable. Assured. Mrs. Tao, Hung's mother, also looked at me and nodded, so I didn't mind too much anymore. That whole day, Hung took me to coffee, to eat specialties in Kinjio, and also introduced me to some of his close friends here. More friends and more knowledge helped me gradually regain my spirit, no longer as sad as the past few days. In the evening, Hung invited me to grill food and drink at a shrimp soup hut at Hung's friend Tuan's house, as well as to congratulate me on joining their bachelor club. After drinking, I felt a bit stiff in my stomach, so I asked Tuan, "Hey buddy, where is the bathroom here?" When Tuan heard me ask, he laughed, his voice mocking. "Everywhere in this square is a toilet, don't go into the square and kill my shrimp." It's a bit rural, but I'm not angry because it's true that even though it's a city district, it's still like being in the countryside. The people here are sincere, honest and very comfortable, even in business and travel. Toilet. I looked around and decided to choose a bush behind the hut because it was quite far from Tuan's shrimp square. While I was using water to save my life, I heard someone whispering on the other side of the bushes. After zipping up my pants, I curiously walked towards the sound, thinking as I walked, "That's strange, Tang Tuan said his house is not near anyone's house, so there's a voice talking like that." Lifting the branches of the tree to look out, there was no one there, the whispers had completely disappeared, and in front of us was a very large empty space, seemingly abandoned farmland. While I was wondering, a black shadow jumped out, startling me. The shadow ran for a while, then stopped, turned towards me, looked at me, and barked loudly. "So it's a dog," I laughed. The dog barked a few times, then howled for a long time and ran away. Even though the moon is not full tonight, it is still very bright, so I can see over a long stretch of field, with the forest at the end of the field. In the dim silver light, I suddenly saw something flying in the sky. It's a round, black thing with strings fluttering behind it like a tail. I smiled and said to myself, "What crazy person is flying a kite at this hour? But what kind of kite is so round, how can it fly?" It kept gliding back and forth above my head like that for a while, then swooped down into a black pile lying on the field and was never seen again. I thought the kite might have broken its string, so I stopped watching and went back to my two friends. They were still drinking and singing drunkenly. I sat down and told the two guys what I had just met. As soon as he finished telling the story, he saw the two boys' faces change color, from red to pale. Tuan hurriedly cleaned up the drinks while Hung helped and said to me, "Well, it's late, quickly clean up and go home." I looked at the clock, it was only 10 p.m. Because I am a city dweller, this time was still very early for me. I object. "It's still early, let's drink a little more." "I haven't drank it yet." "If you want to go home and drink, I'll buy you beer to drink until morning." "Now go back and let Tuan rest," Hung growled. I turned to Tuan and said, "Tuan, drink a little more and rest." "Soon." Tuan's face turned pale, he shook his head. "Stop, I don't want this to be the last drink of my life." I still don't understand what Tuan said, and I don't understand his and Hung's attitudes. Suddenly Hung reprimanded. "I told you, just sing, why the hell are you knocking on the cup?" Tuan's body was drenched in sweat and he grimaced. "I drink once every once in a while, so I'm just excited. I don't know what it means." As soon as he finished speaking, the sound of a dog howling echoed in the night, causing Hung and Tuan to startle and drop a pile of dishes. Without saying a word, they grabbed my hand and dragged me into the hut. Close the door, then lock it tightly. I was confused and didn't know what was going on. I looked up and saw that the two boys were crawling under the table and the other was holding a basket on their head. They were both trembling. Hung hissed softly through his teeth. "Sit down." Suddenly there was a loud whistling sound of wind blowing outside, accompanied by a dark whisper that kept echoing in the wind. The dog howled mournfully again, then there was a pattering sound like something rolling on a corrugated iron roof. The two windows were banged by the wind and kept banging. My eyes kept looking through the window, then suddenly my eyes saw what I had just seen in the fields behind. I cried out, "Hey guys, that's the kite I was telling you about. I don't know who flies kites at this hour." Hung crawled closer to me and gave me a painful kick. "Fuck your head, if you don't hide so he can see, you're dead." Saying this, Hung pushed my head under the table. But because of my curious nature, I still tried to look through the window to see what that kite actually was. The whispering became clearer and clearer, sounding like it was only a few feet away. And then something happened. From the side of the window, a white face slowly appeared. First is the nose, then the mouth and eyes, then the long hair fluttering in the wind. A young girl's face appeared under the moonlight by the window. Her face slowly turned to look straight into the hut. Her eyes full of blood kept moving back and forth as if looking for something. Her mouth moved continuously, making unintelligible hissing sounds. Her head kept tilting sideways, looking back, as if she didn't see us. I don't know who this woman is, but why do Hung and Tuan seem so afraid of her? I tried to lean up a bit to see more clearly and discovered one thing: where was her body? I have to say, it was the first time in my life that I saw such a horrifying scene. My arms and legs trembled as I looked at that head floating in the middle of the window. Just as I was about to scream, a hand clamped over my mouth. When I turned around, it was Hung. He raised his finger to signal, "Shush," and then whispered, "Do not look." The three boys remained silent, not daring to make even the slightest sound. Suddenly, bang, 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 there was a very strong banging sound on the door, startling all three. The sound sounded like someone was trying to break down the door. Looking back, the old hinge seemed like it was about to come off. I heard a groan coming from Tuan. His two hands were still holding the basket on his head, and from below his feet, a stream of water slowly flowed out. He peed in Mom's pants. Hung's eyes and nose were streaming like a crying baby. As for me, I was no better than them. My hands clutched my head tightly, my whole body trembling. Then its head shook a few times, its mouth wheezed like a snake, and after a while it seemed to see no one. It slowly turned around and flew away. The sound of banging on the door is no longer there. The three guys remained in the same position because they were afraid that terrible thing would come back. A few minutes passed, everything was still silent, then Hung slowly stood up, walked to the window, looked to one side, glanced to the other and signaled. Luckily, it's gone. Tuan then put down the basket, clasped his hands together, and muttered, "I thank my grandparents for their blessings and help me through this accident. From now on, I don't dare to drink anymore. I still haven't recovered yet, my voice is trembling. Which of you two can tell me what the hell that thing is?" Hung didn't answer and turned to me and urged, "Let's go home. When I get home, I'll tell you. I am worried." "What about Tuan? Leave it alone here." Tuan stood up and waved his hand. "Don't worry, it's not the first time I've met him. It's just never been this close. Besides, if I lock the door, it can't do anything. After that, Hung and I said goodbye to Tuan and took the car to go home. As soon as he got in the car, Hung started the engine and ran like crazy. If I didn't have time to hug him, I would have thrown his grandmother to the ground. I grimaced. "Run slowly," Hung said. "Run quickly home." But I naturally feel worried. I keep feeling like that thing hasn't forgiven me yet. Hung's father's grandmother has a stinky mouth like a temple. As soon as he finished speaking, I looked through the rearview mirror and I clearly saw something black flying right behind me, only about 1 meter away. I had goosebumps all over my body. An electric current running down my spine made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I panicked. "Run faster, faster, faster." Hung saw me urging him and immediately looked annoyed. "This guy, you just blamed me for running so fast and now you're asking me to run faster." I patted its head and shouted loudly, "It's getting close to my ass, hurry up." Immediately, Hung turned the gas and sped away, his face sad, and I closed my eyes tightly, muttering the prayer. Namo Amitabha Buddha, Namo Amitabha Buddha. After running for a while, I slowly opened my eyes and looked back, but oh my God, it was still close to my ass, the distance was still the same, as if it was deliberately toying with us. Hung asked loudly, "Is it still chasing?" "I'm still chasing you all this time," I replied with a trembling voice. Hung turned around and looked for a few seconds, then he slowly slowed down and stopped completely. I didn't understand why, but he climbed down from the car, picked up the thing that had scared the two guys to pee, and said, "Grandpa, I tied the bag of pork intestines to the back of the bag. I bought it for my mother to cook porridge tomorrow, but you make me afraid to see her too." I scratched my head and smiled, but inside I felt much lighter. Hung carried a bag of pork intestines and hung them out in front before pedaling his bike. "Damn it, why is it suddenly so immortal?" Hung said. I blurted out, "What kind of fake car is that? Why is it so bad?" Hung smiled and said, "Sorry, the '67 car is old. If you like to run then run, if you like to be naughty then be naughty." The two guys didn't know what to do. At 11 to 12 o'clock at night, there is no place to repair the car. This stretch of road has shrimp fields or fields on both sides. Looking into the distance, I see a few houses located deep inside. I have to walk in the hope that a truck will pass by and ask for a ride. While he was busy pushing the cart, suddenly an uncle walked out of the fields. He looked at the two guys and asked, "Is your car broken?" The two guys nodded, looking bored. Looking at our sad faces, the uncle signaled, "There is no place to repair cars at this hour, and there are also no hotels or motels nearby. Well, you two go back to my uncle's house to sleep for the night. Tomorrow morning I'll drive to the end of the road and get a mechanic to come fix it." The two guys were overjoyed. They didn't expect that in the middle of the night, a kind uncle would let them sleep over. The two guys thanked him profusely and then took the car and followed him home. After walking for about 10 minutes, my uncle told me to turn onto a dirt road, and from there, go another 100 meters to reach his house. The wooden house with the tiled roof is old and dark inside. The uncle opened the lock, walked in and said, "I'm sorry, you guys haven't paid the electricity bill this month, so they've already cut it off. Now the two of us take the trouble to use oil lamps and candles. But here, you don't need a fan to sleep. At night, the breeze is very cool. It might even be cold. Suddenly, I heard my uncle say that you don't need to close the door to sleep, and then the cool breeze suddenly reminded me of what happened earlier. I shivered a few times and then reassured myself, never mind, it's better than sleeping in the field anyway. The two children followed him into the house, at which point he introduced himself as though telling them to make themselves at home because he was alone. Then he led the two kids to the back, stopping in front of a room, to be exact, a room made up of several plywood panels and separated from the outside by a parachute curtain. Inside there is a small bamboo bed big enough for one person to lie on, next to it is a worn hammock. Tonight you two will sleep here. Open the window to cool down and sleep easier. Mr. Though pointed to a small window on the wall. He left behind an oil lamp. Just as he was about to leave, he turned back and added, "The bathroom is at the end of the house, next to it is a room. Don't go in there, you two. In there is an old barn, he hasn't cleaned it in a long time, so there are a lot of rice bushes with insects and snakes. Remember?" Having finished speaking, he went out, leaving only me and Hung alone. I said, "You should sleep in a hammock." "I'm not used to lying in a hammock." Hung said yes for an hour, then climbed into the hammock and said, "Hey Tan, open the window to cool down, it's too hot." I went over and opened the window. Outside, the moonlight was dim, but I could clearly see a pond on the side of the house. Around the bank were several bamboo bushes growing tightly together, swaying in the wind, making dull sounds. Gut brain. Looming behind the bamboo groves are a few graves, probably belonging to Mr. Though's family. A gust of wind rushed in, making me cold. I immediately closed the window, just half closed it to let in a little breeze, then hurriedly climbed into bed. Hung saw that and asked, "Well, why don't you open it all to let it cool, but only a little?" I shook my head and said, "Stop it, Grandpa, there are a few graves out there, and the bamboo bushes keep rustling, making me want to die." Hearing that, Hung also felt cold. "Yes, stop sleeping." I nodded and the two guys closed their eyes and decided to sleep to forget their fear. Even though I say that, how can I sleep? It's strange, the weather is hot, Hung keeps swinging the hammock and squeaking, the umbrella keeps swaying gently even though there isn't any wind to keep me afloat. Chicken skin. I struggled to sleep, so I kept lying with my eyes open, looking around the room, imagining that maybe outside the window, there was someone standing there, with open white eyes looking at me. "Come in here." Hung. Hung. "Are you sleeping yet?" I called for it a few times and saw it lying still, its legs no longer swinging. "Mom, this guy makes it so easy to sleep watching this." Not knowing what to do, I closed my eyes and tried to dispel the vague fears. Just as I fell asleep, a rustling sound outside startled me. I grimaced and sat up, my eyes were stinging. After sitting for a while, I heard a rustling sound like something passing through the bamboo bushes. I ventured closer to the window, peeked through the narrow gap, but saw nothing. Maybe it's just the sound of the wind, I reassured myself, but as soon as I turned around, I stopped dead when I clearly saw a figure. The person imprinted on the cloth is facing into the room. I trembled and said each difficult word. "Uncle Though, is that you?" When I picked up the oil lamp to see clearly, my parents, the figure below was empty, like it was floating above the ground. I dragged myself back, shaking Hung hard. "Hung, wake up, "Wake up, there's a ghost, there's a ghost." Hung mumbled a few times, then turned around, rubbed his eyes, looked at me, then looked at the curtain and said, "Where is the ghost? I don't see anything." There was actually nothing on the curtain, so I told him I saw a human figure clearly printed on it. Just as he finished speaking, there was a rushing sound from the bathroom, as if someone was taking a shower. At 12 o'clock at night, Uncle though, is he going to take a bath? Curious, Hung lifted the curtain and saw that it was dark there. Hung asked me to stand here so he could go over there and see what was going on. When passing by the old barn, a cold wind blew through the door. It seemed like there was light inside. There was a small hole in the door. Hung looked into the hole and he screamed and then fainted on the spot. I immediately ran to help it up, constantly calling out, "Hung, wake up, what's wrong with you, Hung?" His eyes gradually opened, but his face was pale, his hand trembling as he pointed to the hole. I took it out and looked at it. Oh, there are no words to describe the fear at that moment. Right behind the hole was the head of the girl from earlier lying on the table, two bloodshot eyes looking back towards me. Just then, the bathroom door suddenly opened with a loud noise, making the two guys jump. Standing right at the door was a body without a head, raising its arms and walking towards me and Hung. The two guys, without telling anyone, immediately crossed their legs and ran out of the house. I never thought I could run so fast, reaching the main road in one go. Luckily, at that moment, a truck passed by. Hung and I immediately shouted for the driver to stop. There was no blood left on each guy's face. "Why are you two running like you're being chased by a ghost?" the driver asked. Yes, it was true that I was chased by a ghost. "Please give us a ride to town, I'm begging you, brother." Hung groaned. The driver signaled us to get in the car and drove away. Hung sat in the middle, I sat close to the outside. Looking through the rearview mirror, I saw Uncle though standing right on the dirt road, staring at us. When we got to town, Hung and I climbed down to thank the driver and then walked home. I asked, "What about the 67, what do you think?" "Leave it there," Hung replied, "I'll pick it up tomorrow morning. That car is old, no one will take it." Walked about 2 kilometers to get back to Hung's house. It was 1:30 a.m., his house had turned off all the night lights, leaving only a small neon light bulb on the front porch. Hung opened the door, he and I slowly walked into the house. As soon as they entered the room, both guys lay down on the bed, feeling comfortable and relieved. Hung said, "Are you going to take a shower? If there is, then go first and then come to me." Actually, I was still haunted by the headless body running out of Mr. Thou's bathroom, so I hesitated a bit. "Well, I guess I'll sleep now. So tired. Now I just want to get some sleep." "But you haven't told me about your head just now." "Yes, I'll tell you tomorrow morning. I'm going to take a shower now. You go to sleep first." After saying that, Hung opened the closet to get some clothes and went to the bathroom. While I lay down on the bed, my eyes were tired, my body was achy, so I slowly fell asleep without knowing it. Hung poured water to forget the horrifying moments just now. This wasn't the first time he had seen a ghost, but seeing it up close was extremely scary. After taking a shower, as soon as I pulled the door open, Hung shouted loudly, "Where did you come back at this hour? Why did you scream like you saw a ghost when you saw me?" So it's Mr. Chow and Hung's father. He was sleeping when he heard the sound of water pouring, so he went down to see. it turned out to be his son. Hung stammered. Yes, Tan and I went to drink at Tuan's shrimp farm just back. Then Hung told Mr. Chow everything he had encountered. But he didn't seem to believe it, thinking it was because the three guys got drunk and turned into hoes. He told Hung to go to sleep. Tomorrow he would run out there to get the car and come back to see if there was a ghost in that house like Hung said. The next morning, Hung left me at home and then went with Mr. Chow to Uncle Tho's house. Dad, slow down, it seems like it's almost there. Hung signaled and pointed to a dirt road. Mr. Chai turned the car and drove about 100 meters as Hung said, then stopped, looked around and said, I don't see any house. There's a torn hut over there. Hung scratched his head and ears, his face wrinkled like a monkey eating chili. Obviously here, he pointed, there is a pond, then around are some bamboo bushes, there are a few more graves, right here. But his house is made of wood and has a tiled roof, not a hut. While Hung was speaking, he suddenly stopped. He suddenly felt like he should go to the graves to take a look. It weaved its way through bamboo stalks as big as human calves, behind which were 3 graves lying on the same level. It's impossible to know who they are because the steels have faded over time. Only one large grave on the edge can still be seen. Hung used his hand to brush off the dust and dirt on the surface of the beer, then it fell out, stammering. Mr. Uncle Tho. On the tombstone, it is clearly written that Nguyen Van Tho, 53 years old, died, and his face is unmistakable. So last night, both boys were led here by Uncle Tho's ghost, which made them see an illusion of the house, which was actually just a torn and collapsed hut. Hung stood up, groped his way to the hut and looked into it. Everything was as Hung predicted, the 67 was lying inside the hut. He absent-mindedly took the bike out, climbed on the bike to try it out, and the engine started crisply, it didn't seem damaged at all. Mr. Chow saw that and immediately cursed. Mom, from now on, don't go out drinking at night anymore. Don't you know there are a lot of ghosts and weeds in this district? One day it takes your soul away. Hung was devastated when he heard it. He agreed and drove home with Mr. Chow. When he got home, he saw me sitting and sipping a cup of coffee, so he sat down and told me the story of Uncle Tho. As soon as I finished listening, I sprayed coffee straight into his face. What, are you saying he's dead? So you and I saw a ghost twice last night? Hung used his hand to wipe the coffee off his face, grimacing. If you see a ghost, you've already met one. Do you need to spray coffee all over my face like that? I smiled and apologized to him. I honestly didn't expect that on this trip I would be able to see demons with my own eyes, something I had only seen in movies before. After drinking coffee and having breakfast, Hung and I changed clothes and went out to take care of the mango garden. Hung's family, in addition to his mother selling breakfast, part of his income comes from a mango garden that is almost as large as a football field. It was the first time I saw so many mangoes. Each tree had heavy fruit, some green, some ripe and yellow. I excitedly climbed up a mango tree with a low branch, broke a fruit and peeled it off to eat on the spot. While eating a delicious mango, I saw a person standing behind some trees in the distance. I said, "Hey Hung, do you hire a gardener?" Hung was standing around holding a water pipe and said loudly, "No, I didn't hire anyone." I then pointed towards the fence and said, "Oh, why do I see someone standing over there?" Hung heard that and immediately put down the water pipe. He looked at my hand and grumbled, This guy, when he meets a ghost, he sees people everywhere. I don't see anyone. I also thought maybe I was looking at it wrong, so I continued to peel the mango and eat it. The afternoon sky was brightly sunny and suddenly dark clouds appeared to cover the sky. It must be said that no matter how beautiful and cool the mango garden is, the lack of light makes it gloomy and creepy. I fell to the ground and said, "Hey, does it suddenly want to rain or something? It's so gloomy." Hung also nodded in agreement. He looked up at the sky and saw thick dark clouds, mixed with flickering lightning. The rumbling sound signals that this is a heavy rain even though there is still no wind at this time. "Let's go home, I didn't bring a raincoat with me just now. If it rains heavily, there will be no place to hide." After speaking, the two guys cleaned up their tools and walked towards the exit gate. As they approached, both guys were startled when they saw a person standing with his back turned this way. Suddenly I felt worried. I thought, "Don't tell me." Looking from the back, it appears to be a woman because of her long black hair flowing down her back. She just stood still like a statue, not moving an inch. "Sister, what sister?" Hung softly called out to that person, but it seemed she didn't hear him. Seeing that, I took a few steps forward and called out, "What sister? Why are you standing here?" Oh my God, as soon as I gently touched her, her head moved slightly and then fell to the ground, revealing a familiar white face. I stood frozen, groaning. Hung, is it?" I didn't hear Hung's voice. When I turned around, he had already run 10 meters. As he ran, he turned around and shouted, "Run away, Mom, why are you calling me there anymore?" "Bastard friend," I jokingly ran away, mumbling curses at Hung. Just after passing about 10 rows of trees, it started to rain heavily. Water poured into my face, causing me to no longer be able to see clearly in front of me. I crashed into something, causing me to fall forward. Before I could come to my senses, my hand touched something soft and round, very comfortable in my hand. Hung standing next to him kept muttering, pointing at the ground. Looking back, alas, my hand was squeezing the female ghost's breasts. Of course there was no head there. My face was distorted. Before I could let go, his hands tightened around my neck, making me suffocate while Hung still stood there staring because he was so scared. "Help, save me, I'm about to die," still standing there, looking, dog. As soon as Hung heard that, he immediately regained his composure. He rushed to help me pry off those delicate hands that were as hard as rocks. After struggling for a while, I was able to escape. Hung and I continued to run. Suddenly, Hung jumped backwards as if something was holding him back. He cried, "I've been caught, run away, remember to tell my grandparents that if they collect my body, they should bury it, not burn it, I'm afraid of the heat." How could I leave my friends behind? I rushed back to save him and realized his shirt was stuck on a tree branch. It's so miserable, your shirt just got caught on a tree branch and you're so worried about what you're doing. Run fast. After removing the shirt, the body also came after me, so Hung and I started running again. Suddenly I had an idea. I turned to Hung and said, "It's only one person, now I count to 3, my friend and I split into 2 directions, whoever can get to the 67 first will start the engine, wait for the other guy to come out, then take off." "Oh okay." Hung was breathing heavily and nodded. I count. 1, 2, 3. As soon as the third sound was shouted, Hung and I split into 2 directions. My body suddenly stopped for a moment because I didn't know who to chase, but then he immediately left me and ran after Hung. I breathed a sigh of relief but also did not forget the plan I had outlined. After running a few dozen meters, I reached the gate. From there I could see the 67 parked right at the entrance. I hurriedly ran over and climbed on the engine. Luckily, it was not damaged like yesterday. I turned the throttle a few times to warm up the engine and waited. In less than a minute, I heard Hung's screams. He was running and screaming. Right behind was the devil's body chasing closely. I ran slowly, gaining momentum, then waited for Hung to jump up and then turned on the accelerator. Looking back, the body slowly slowed down and stood still. Yee, yee. Hung and I high-fived each other happily because we were once again lucky enough to escape that female ghost. When we got home, the rain had just stopped. Hung and I changed clothes and went into the room to lie down and breathe. I've only been here for 2 days, but it's all bad luck. I sighed. I guess I'll go to Saigon again. Aren't there ghosts here? Hung looked at me and smiled, his voice joking. I told you about this that you will stop being sad, and you will also meet a new sister. Just now I saw you squeezing the ghost too. What, do you feel high? I didn't think that after everything, my bad friend could still be so rude. I sidestep. I'm afraid I'll pee there and get high, but why does that ghost girl keep following us? I don't know either. Hung shook his head. Tuan and I saw it a few times. The last few times it was just a fleeting moment. Why has it suddenly been following us since yesterday? Is it possible? Hung hesitated, then looked at me with his meaningful eyes and said, or maybe it's compatible with you and loves you, so just chase after it. Right. I patted its head and glared. Right on your head, didn't you see that he was strangling me just now? Hung laughed and then the two of them didn't say anything else. I lay down with my hand on my forehead thinking and then gradually fell asleep. The sound of pounding footsteps and the sound of people talking loudly startled me awake. Looking out the window, it was completely dark, and my stomach began to rumble from hunger. I opened the door to go out and was horrified to see Ms. Tram, Hung's biological sister, lying limply on the ground, her eyes wide open, her mouth yawning like a fish on dry land. Mrs. Tao was continuously rubbing oil on her forehead, her hands, then pulling her bangs, rubbing and calling her name. Mr. Chow put oil on her feet and generally did everything he could to make Ms. Tram's body hot. I quickly rushed forward to lend a hand, my voice blurting out, "What is wrong with Ms. Tram?" Mr. Chow looked extremely worried and said, "I don't know anymore." He was standing there grinding sugarcane juice to sell to people when he suddenly fell sideways, his body jerking as if he was having an epileptic seizure. But has it ever happened like that before? While speaking, Ms. Tram suddenly let out a pitiful scream, her arms and legs flailing, pushing all three people a meter away. Then he slowly stood up, his body contorted a few times, his eyes were dark. Ms. Tram let out a voice, but the voice just sounded strange, as if there was a man's voice mixed in there. It kept buzzing like a radio with no signal. "It is mine." Then Ms. Tram burst out laughing. I was stunned, not knowing what was going on. Looking over, I saw Ms. Tao holding Mr. Chow's hand, her face pale with fear, and his face was as pale as leaves. He whispered, "Damn, it's possessed by ghosts." As soon as Mr. Chow finished speaking, Ms. Tram let out a wild scream, looked at the three people with her white eyes, her hands twitched, her body jerking like a convulsion. Ms. Tram, or rather the ghost in her body, just screamed at this moment. "I'm back here, I'll make your whole family live in peace." Just then, Hung came home. Seeing Ms. Tram like that, he thought he was arguing with his parents. He immediately threw down the bundle of sugar cane he was carrying on his shoulder, ran to pull Ms. Tram's shoulder, and raised his voice. "Ms. Tram, why are you so rude today? Do you believe that I—" It was speechless when Tram's head turned 180 degrees, looking at it with white eyes, making a purring sound in her throat. Hung's face was stunned. He let go of his hand, took a few steps back and sat down on the ground. You, continue, as if I didn't say anything." As soon as Ms. Tram wasn't paying attention, Mr. Chow immediately rushed forward and hugged the person who pointed at him tightly. Mrs. Tao saw this and also rushed to help her husband. "Hung, quickly run to the back of the house and break a strawberry branch here. As for Tan, run up to the altar where I have a few yellow talismans under the incense stick. Quickly get them for me." Hung understood. He quickly sat up and ran to the back of the house. As for me, I also ran up to the altar to look for the talisman. After the two boys returned, Tram was struggling, screaming fiercely, and her eyes were bloodshot. Mr. Chow and his wife pursed their lips and tried to hold her back, sweat pouring down their entire bodies. He looked at Hung and said, "Now I count to 3. Dad and Mom, let go of your sister. You take a mulberry tree branch and whip her straight on the back. Just hit hard, don't be afraid, that's the only way to save your sister, you know." Hung was sweating profusely, holding a strawberry branch in his hand. Then he looked at me and continued, "As for Tan, keep the talisman ready. When you come out, stick it on Tram's body, remember?" I nodded and took a stance. Mr. Chow then started counting. As soon as he counted to 3, Mr. and Mrs. Tao broke free, and Hung quickly slipped out behind him, whipping the mulberry branch at his sister's back. I don't know if this worked, but I just saw Ms. Tram screaming in pain, her whole body convulsing and lying face down on the ground. Hung was whipping very enthusiastically. A whooshing sound sounded like he was hitting his enemy. I looked at him and felt a burning sensation on my back. After beating for a while, Miss Tram could only make a very small moan. At this moment, Mr. Chow immediately signaled. "It's very weak, don't fight anymore." Hung put a charm on it, Tan. "Anyway, this is the first time I've done this kind of exorcism, so I just followed Mr. Pot's instructions and didn't really know where to put it correctly." Both scared and worried, my hands kept shaking. Mr. Chow saw this and shouted, "Hurry, it's recovering now." Mr. Chow's scream made me jump. I desperately tried to stick it, but it stuck right on Ms. Tram's butt. After I finished pasting, I immediately pulled my hand back, looked at Mr. Chow, and stammered, "Is it okay, Uncle, is it okay?" He looked at me with bored eyes and then exhaled. Hung hit me once and said, "Have you run out of stickers?" I blushed and mumbled, "Sorry, I'm so scared." Mrs. Tao ran back to help Ms. Tram. Her breathing and face had just returned to normal, but she was unconscious. Ms. Tao's eyes were wet with tears. She kept calling Ms. Tram's name. Mr. Chai grabbed her shoulder and slowly said, "It's okay, don't worry." Then he turned to Hung and said, "Help your mother carry your sister to the room to rest." After taking Tram into the room, Hung turned and asked his father, "Dad, is Tram okay?" He sighed. "Your sister has been weak since she was a child, so she was easily possessed by ghosts. Fortunately, I have a few tricks, otherwise I wouldn't know what would happen now. I kept wondering about the ghost's words just now, so I ventured to ask. Uncle, what did the ghost mean when he said, returned, and then said he would take revenge on them all? Mr. Chow seemed to avoid my question. He talked about something else. Hung, run to the temple outside the intersection and ask the monk for a bracelet of magic beads for your sister to wear to pray for peace. Hung nodded, then he invited me to go to the temple with him. After running for a while, I asked, "Hey Hung, your dad is really good. Just now, I saw how calm he was." Hearing the praise, Hung's nostrils widened and he raised his head proudly. "Hey, there's still something to say. A while ago, he once went to exorcise ghosts in Lainan. He heard that that house had several ghosts following and causing trouble that he couldn't get rid of. My father and I finished it in just one meal. Did you witness it?" I asked. Hung hummed. "Well, listen to my mother." I just smiled, but inside I was still confused about what happened earlier. The ghost's words were aimed at Hung's family, or more accurately, Mr. Chow. In addition to the fact that Mr. Chow often exorcises evil spirits, has he offended anyone? It seems that the evil spirit really hates Mr. Pot. After arriving at the temple, I sat outside and waited while Hung went inside to ask for a magic circle. About 10 minutes later, he came out, his face sad. "What's wrong, can't you ask?" Hung shook his head. "The monk is going to the city on business for a few days and won't be back for a few days." Sigh. Hung was discouraged and turned around and drove home. He told Mr. Chow that the monk was not at the temple. Mr. Chow didn't say anything after hearing it. His face hardened and he left to go back to his room. Hung and I sat outside on the bench in front of the house. Hung was smoking a cigarette inside. "I'm so bored, why is something wrong?" "Actually, I really want to return to Saigon, but it seems like there is something holding me back here, a mystery that I must discover." Suddenly, Hung's phone rang. He answered it, then hung up after a few seconds. Then he looked at me and said, "Hey, want to come over to my cousin's house for a drink? I'm so bored right now, I drink to help myself sleep." "Where?" I asked. "Out at the beach, April 30th. He has a seafood restaurant out there. There are a lot of storms this season, so there are no customers, so we invited us out for a drink. Go." Hung said it like he was giving orders, but it was also true. This is his country, and I was at his house. What did he ask me to do? I didn't dare argue. Besides, I was going out drinking. "Never mind, get drunk so you can sleep," I thought to myself, and then climbed into the car so Hung could take me there. At 8 o'clock at night, the sea was cool and windy. As I approached, I heard the whispering sound of ocean waves. That sound combined with the cool wind made me feel extremely relaxed and comfortable. Hung drove through the gate, then drove on a small cement road about 50 meters to reach the shop. As soon as I arrived, a man about 35 to 36 years old came out and waved. "Here you go, come in." The person who welcomed us was Mr. Min, Hung's cousin. He led the two boys to a wooden table, where another person was also sitting there. Everyone introduced each other and a waiter brought out a plate of coconut shrimp, a few plates of snails and clams, and a case of tiger beer. The drinking party then began. Everyone drank and passionately talked about everything in heaven and earth. After talking for a while, Mr. Min asked, "Hey Hung, I heard that tram was possessed by ghosts this afternoon. Hung nodded and then continued. Mom, where are them being so high these days? I just met T yesterday. Mr. Min spoke while pointing to Mr. T, Min's younger brother. When Mr. T heard about me, he immediately said, Yes, I just met you yesterday. At that time, I had just returned from the night shift, around 11 or 12 o'clock at night. Run across the temporary bridge on the main road leading to the district center. But we already know that part of the road at night is so gloomy and creepy, both sides of the road are fields and empty mounds. Hung and I listened attentively. Mr. T gulped down almost the entire glass of beer. His voice seemed to have warmed up. He continued. Normally I'm used to going home at that time, but I never see anything. Suddenly, while driving yesterday, I clearly saw someone's head looming over the bridge. I thought, why are they so busy today that they came all the way here? Then I decided to run over and tease him. Who cares, do you know what I see? Hung and I were so curious that we reached the top and took turns. What do you see? What do you see? Mr. T rubbed his arm a few times. His body was full of goosebumps. Remembering that scene, I still want to play lottery. A whole human body sat perched on the edge of the bridge, but it had no head. Do you know where the head is? The two boys trembled, thinking, could it be that Mr. T also met a headless female ghost like him? Hung urgently urged. Mr. T, please tell your mother. Mr. T, I can't stand this, Mr. T. Mr. T's face tightened, his hand slowly raised, and then he suddenly said loudly, Behind us. Hung and I turned around reflexively, and oh my God, a bloody face appeared before our eyes. I screamed and jumped a meter away, while Hung sat frozen in place, his eyes wide open. Suddenly, Mr. T banged on the table and then hugged his stomach and laughed, making Hung and I not understand anything. It turned out that the bloody face was just a mask prepared by Mr. Min to scare the two guys. I returned to the table with an embarrassed face. Mr. T laughed and said, Sorry you two, Min and I were joking for fun. But I admit that Hung is really tough. Even though I scared him, he remained silent and didn't react. Hung grimaced. If you play, who will play against you, T? Mr. Min took off his mask, patted Hung's shoulder a few times and then returned to his seat. The drinking continued. Hung and I laughed it off. Suddenly I noticed something strange about my friend. I leaned into his ear and asked, Hey, why are you suddenly so quiet? It kept the same expression on its face, its voice whispering. My pants are wet, so uncomfortable. I almost would have burst out laughing if I hadn't met his bullet-shaped eyes. I swallowed my smile and continued to pretend like nothing happened. After drinking for a while, T stood up and said, I'm going to pee, is anyone else going? I replied, Yes, I don't have it. He turned to Hung and asked, Are you going? Hung opened his mouth to answer when I interrupted. Yes, it just went away. Accompanied by a playful look from me to Hung. It was very bitter, but I had to silently nod because I was afraid the two older brothers would find out about my embarrassing story. T had been walking for 10 minutes when the wind began to blow strongly. Even though it was evening, one could still see the ocean waves roaring and creating white foam. The rows of pine trees along the wall kept ringing sadly, then small raindrops began to fall on the tin roof. Rain. Why does the weather forecast say it won't rain tonight? Mr. Min muttered and ran to pull the umbrella and awning out to keep it from getting wet. Hung and I ran after my father. Suddenly I heard a loud cry in the sound of wind and rain. I ran over and poked Hung and Min on the shoulder to listen, and they also confirmed they heard. After listening for a while, the crying got closer and closer, making all three of them start to get scared and look around to see where the crying was coming from. At this time, Mr. T turned around, but his face was grimacing. He squeezed his shoulder and rotated his arm. "Why are your shoulders suddenly so heavy and tired?" Hung stood closer to Mr. T. Hearing him say that, he immediately turned to look, and once again, a stream of water flowed from his crotch to his legs. Min and I looked at it and couldn't help but be shocked. On Ti's shoulder was a girl with long black hair, but her body was blurry like images from old movies from the 50s and 60s. She covered her face with both hands and sobbed. Her cries seemed choked with something choked and resentful. It seemed that T was the only one who didn't realize that. The more he walked, the more scared the three of them became. "What's wrong with you guys?" Just then, he saw a few pieces of garlic on the table. Min quickly gathered each small piece and threw it at the ghost. It screamed a few times, then its two eyes opened as wide as two bowls, the pupils protruded completely, the mouth was almost as long as the chest, the two hands held its head, showing extreme pain. Mr. Min saw that it seemed to work. He continued to fight a few more times when a shrill scream rang out, causing all three to cover their ears, everyone's faces turning pale with fear. After that, the ghost disappeared and Mr. T fell to the ground unconscious. Everyone carried him inside and placed him on a mattress, then used oil to massage him. About 10 minutes later, T woke up and didn't seem to remember anything. "Why am I lying here? Have I finished drinking?" Mr. Min recounted what happened to Mr. T and his face turned pale. He clasped his hands in absolution a few times and then asked to go home and not drink anymore. Hung and I also said goodbye to Min and left. The dense appearance of ghosts next to Hung's family members seems to prove that the ghost's words possessing Ms. Tram are correct. There is a certain secret related to Mr. Chow, but it seems he has hidden it from his own family. I told Hung. "Hey Hung, did your father ever touch anyone when he was working?" Hung replied, "I don't know, but before, people often came to my father's house to give gifts and money to thank him. I've never seen anyone come to my house to curse." While thinking, Hung suddenly slowed down, looked ahead, looked back, then looked at both sides of the road. At this time, the street was deserted without a single person or vehicle, the rain kept falling sporadically, the air was extremely cold. "Tan, do you see the temple across the street?" "Yes, so what?" I asked again. I've never seen Hung so serious. He said, "Pay close attention to its position." After saying that, Hung turned the gas and sped away. After about 500 meters, he drove slowly again, his face tightened, and he pointed. "Look over there." I was startled. Across the street was a temple exactly like the one I had just seen. I blurted out, "Why is this the same as before?" The surrounding trees, the location of the electric pole next to it, and the furniture inside the temple are also similar. Hung said with a trembling voice, "For you it's 2 times, for me it's 4 times I've seen it." Listening to Hung's words, my mind was stunned. Maybe. I'm speechless, too many scary things keep happening to us. Hung was silent. He turned the car around and ran back hoping there would be an exit. After running about 1 kilometer, it seemed like the surrounding scenery had changed, but everything was just the beginning. Because in front of Hung and I are a wooden house with a sagging tile roof, a pond, and surrounded by dense bamboo bushes. Inside the bamboo bushes are 3 graves, one of which is Mr. Tho's grave. Hung suddenly braked, causing me and him to fall forward. Why did we get here after running for a while? Obviously this road cannot lead to Mr. Tho's house. But the strange thing is that the hut that Hung and his father saw in the morning has now become a wooden house with a tiled roof. Hung said in a sad voice, "Mom, I can't stand this all the time." My mind was completely confused. I didn't know what to do, so I urged, "Run, Hung, what are you doing standing here?" Tang Hung revved the engine. The car suddenly made a few beeping sounds as if it had choked on fuel and then turned off the engine. No matter how much I pedaled, I couldn't start the engine again. "Forget it, I'm with you, Tan." I hurriedly climbed down and signaled, "Let me push." I put all my strength into my butt and leg muscles, pushing the 67 heavily. Hung sat on the gas pedal hoping the car would start again, but it just beeped a few more times. Run out of. Completely at a loss, I stood there breathing heavily, when suddenly Hung nudged my hand. He didn't say anything, his face was extremely tense, he just pointed at his ear, telling me to listen to something. In the middle of the night there was not a single person, only the rustling sound of the wind and the sound of the drizzle, mixed in with the laughter of a child. Hung immediately knelt down. In the middle of the night, he clasped his hands and bowed as if he was being punished by heaven, praying continuously. I bow to the heavens and the earth. I pray to the gods to bless us from the accident. I'll go home and offer the roasted duck to the gods. It was bowing when it suddenly stopped, because from afar it saw a small white lump slowly approaching. He and I could only stand still, staring at that thing getting closer and closer. Then the 2 guys panicked and they realized that the white lump was a newborn baby. It ran and laughed, making a sound that I can't use words to describe. But the scariest thing is, on its belly there is still the umbilical cord. The cord trailing behind is a headless corpse that is wiggling, stretching, and kicking continuously. Run! I shouted loudly and grabbed Hung's shirt, who was still kneeling, and pulled him away. In the middle of a deserted field, there was no place to hide except Mr. Tho's wooden house. Fortunately, the door was unlocked. Hung and I rushed straight into the house, slammed the door, and pulled the latch tight. You and I are truly ducks, Hung said with tears in his eyes. He's right, in the past 2 days, he and I have been pushed around like ducks countless times. Suddenly the door shook violently. 2 guys quickly leaned their backs against the door to block it. The rumble sounded like someone was throwing someone in to break the door. The old hinge shifted completely to one side, causing the door to sag, revealing a small gap. Immediately, a hand with only skin and bones reached in and grabbed Hung's face, causing him to scream loudly. It caught me, save me, save. And for the 3rd time that day, Hung peed again without even zipping his pants. I panicked and quickly turned around, pushed hard a few times, the door slammed shut, then my hand let go of Hung. Then suddenly everything was silent as if nothing had ever happened, the door no longer moved. Is it gone? I breathed a sigh of relief, then took out my phone and turned on the flashlight for a moment. The white light shined around the house once. The house was empty with nothing but a hallway. The darkness made it seem so long. Hopefully, the house has a back door, I said and then signaled Hung. At this time, his face had a few scratches that could have been caused by his fingernails. It touched the scratch and moaned, "My handsome face is gone." He was excited for a few hours and then followed me. The two boys groped in the darkness under the flashlight, gradually passing through the hallway. The room where Hung and I slept the night before was no longer there, but instead was the barn where Mr. Tho forbade him to come near. I touched it curiously and the door gradually opened. The creaking sound of the rusty hinge rang out, giving the two guys goosebumps. Mom and Dad, as soon as the door opened, in front of me was another grave mound, and sitting on top of it was a girl, her hair down covering her face, holding the newborn baby from earlier in her arms. I couldn't have been mistaken because the umbilical cord was still on its belly, connecting to the back of her body. "I told you, you are forbidden from coming in here." A hoarse voice rang out right behind, and Hung and I immediately turned around. Hung fainted on the spot. I was dizzy when I saw Mr. Tho standing right behind, his eyes glowing red in the dark, his skin ulcerated as if it were in a state of decomposition. So, I struggled for a few more seconds and then collapsed unconscious. There was a loud sound of a truck approaching. When I opened my eyes, I found myself lying in the middle of the road, two bright truck lights shining straight into my eyes. I panicked and tried to get up and run away, but my body was stiff. Sweat poured out like a shower, and reflexively I could only raise my hand to block it when at that moment a black shadow jumped out in front of the car. A long sound of braking rang out, followed by a loud crash and loud screams. It all creates a chaotic, noisy sound that gradually fades away. Darkness covers everything. I opened my eyes in surprise. It turned out it was just a dream. I saw myself lying on the grass. In front of me was the temple from before. Hung was also lying nearby with the 67. Sitting up, I went to call Hung. As soon as he woke up, he ran, running and screaming like a crazy person. Maybe it was because his body wasn't used to it, but after running a few steps he fell face down and lay panting on the ground. I had to pull him up again. He looked at me and whispered, "Are they gone? Are they all gone?" "This sick guy," I muttered and nodded. The two guys stood up the car, and this time the car started up crisply as if there had never been any problem. "I suggest you change your car." I grumbled. Hung explained, "It's not his fault, you know that." Hung said vaguely and then ran away. When I got home it was 2 a.m. Everyone in the house was still sleeping. The two guys crept back to their room. Shouldn't he just stay at home and not go anywhere else? I lay down on the bed and groaned. Hung didn't say anything. He lay there, his face blank. It seemed like he was about to reach the limit of his endurance. "Do you know when that temple existed?" I asked. Hung looked at the ceiling, his voice languid. "Several years ago. I heard that one time a young girl committed suicide, jumping into a truck and dying there. Later, there were several more incidents of falling cars right there, so people were afraid to set up a shrine. But it seems like she died tragically." I was startled, so I told Hung about my dream. After listening, Hung said a cold sentence. "So that's right. The soul that's been teasing me for the past 2 days might be that girl who committed suicide." Then it hesitated again. "But, what do you and I have to do with her? Why does she keep haunting us? Also, Mr. Tho, there are still many things that cannot be answered about this matter." Suddenly, there was a fierce barking sound outside, not just one dog but several. Hung jumped up, grabbed a walking stick and put it in the corner of the wardrobe, saying, Mom, it must have been stolen. Follow me. Wow, now I see you're so stiff. Go, I said with a voice full of admiration. The two guys walked out of the room, then went to the back garden. Perhaps because he was in his area, Hung was very aggressive. He held his cane tightly in his hand and invaded first, while I followed behind. From inside the house, one could see outside the fence. There were 2 to 3 dogs barking loudly towards a dark shadow crouching in the corner of the garden, as if they were helping Hung surround the thieves. Wow, the scene is just like in those sensational action movies that I often watch online. While admiring Hung's majestic charisma, as soon as he arrived, Hung suddenly blurted out, "Sister, sister too." Ms. Tram was sitting on the ground, holding a cloth doll in both hands, swinging it and singing softly as if lulling her child. "Ms. Tram is possessed again," I exclaimed. The dogs kept barking loudly. Ms. Tram immediately turned to the dogs, her face wrinkled, her white teeth bared, and she roared, "Leave my child alone to sleep." As soon as Hung heard that, his majestic aura disappeared. He threw his cane to the ground. "Dad, Mom." Hung ran into the house and called his parents. I also backed away a few meters in fear. The dogs turned tail and ran away. Chi Tram continued to sing softly, occasionally giggling and petting the doll as if it were a real person. Mr. Pot ran out first, a mulberry tree branch in his hand. He rushed forward and was about to expel the soul from Ms. Tram's body. He suddenly collapsed. "It's running." Mr. Chai clicked his tongue. He walked over and carried Ms. Tram into the house, his face extremely worried. My heart was still pounding. I said, "It's not peaceful at home anymore." The two guys sneaked into the house. As soon as he entered the room, there was the sound of a motorbike coming from the front of the house. Hung quickly ran out to see and saw Mr. Chai sitting on the motorbike. He looked at him and said, "Dad's going to do some business. You and Tan stay home to watch over me and your mom. I keep the mulberry whip right at the altar. Use it for anything. Lock the door tightly when Dad comes home, he calls. Remember?" After saying that, he started the engine and drove away. Hung locked the door and returned to his room. She passed by and saw that her sister's room was still lit. Perhaps her mother was staying with her. Actually, everything is gradually getting out of control. The only thing left to do is wait for Mr. Chow to return. Hung opened the door for Dad. The knock on the door woke Hung up. He looked at the clock and saw it was only 4 o'clock, so he and I had fallen asleep because we were too tired. Hung slowly walked out the door, looked at his sister's room and saw that the light was off. Perhaps his mother was also asleep. He looked through the narrow crack in the door and saw Mr. Pot's face. Hung opened the door to let his father in and asked, "Where are you going, Dad?" Mr. Pot paused for a few seconds then replied, "Dad went to Aunt Seven's house in the upper neighborhood to ask for some garlic strings and willow branches to hang in front of the door and behind the kitchen. Ready to stop by the temple to ask for some ashes to spread around the house. So you can rest assured somewhat. Otherwise, they'll just keep importing your sister like this and tomorrow your sister will be crazy." Because he was still sleepy, Hung couldn't see clearly what Mr. Bao brought back. He accepted and waited for Mr. Bao to come in before locking the door. The house has charms, now with some garlic strings, willow branches, and Buddha's ashes scattered around. Hung thinks that no ghosts will dare to cause trouble anymore. He returned to his room with peace of mind. seeing me still sleeping, he closed the door. But as soon as she lay down, she suddenly remembered one thing, that Mrs. Seven was alone, no husband, no children, and the main thing was that she had just died of liver cancer. Today was the day they buried her. Tan, get up quickly. Hung slapped my face a few times, making me startled. I looked out the window and it was still dark. I grumbled. What is it, Dad? It's not dawn yet. Why are you waking me up if you're not sleeping? Hung told me about his father's strange attitude. I really didn't think so, so I asked. So what Tuesday you brought home is as he said? Hung replied. I don't know anymore. I was still drunk just now, so I kept humming quickly so I could go back to sleep. I don't know if it was right or not. I was deep in thought. Just then there was a knock on the front door. A familiar voice rang out again. Hung, open the door for me. Even if the sky were to fall now, it wouldn't be able to make Hung and I as scared as we are now. Hung's face was distorted, his teeth were chattering, and I asked him with a trembling voice. Why do you say, your father is in the house? Please come with me, I no longer dare to go alone. Actually, Hung has never felt so scared when he was in his own house. He and I slowly walked out the door. The house was silent, only the sounds of both guys' tense breathing could be heard. When he got to the door, Hung checked the door and it was clear, the lock was still locked inside, so how did Mr. Chow get out? Hung's hands were shaking so much that when he tried to put the key in the lock, he couldn't get it in. I was drenched in sweat even though at 4 to 5 a.m. the weather in the sea was very cold. After a while of suffering with the lock, it was successful. Dad, just got home? Hung asked as he opened the door. Mr. Chow looked surprised and said, Don't you see me standing outside the door? Dad, where are you going? Hung continued asking. Mr. Chow entered the house, took off his coat, put it on the table, and replied. Dad ran to the temple to ask for some ashes to spread around the house, and then stopped at the market to buy some garlic to hang in front of your sister's door. To avoid evil spirits, why do you ask me so carefully? Mr. Chow answered exactly the same as before, but Hung was sure he was not dreaming, so he hesitantly asked one more question. Dad bought garlic at Aunt Seven's house at the market, Dad? Mr. Pot looked at Hung intently. What's wrong with this guy? Mrs. Seven is dead, the house is closed and there is no wholesale business. Dad went to Uncle Two behind the market to buy. This time Mr. Pot's answer was different. But from the way he was talking now, Hung could guess that the person standing in front of him was his father. If so, then the person from before was. At that moment, a scream came from Ms. Tram's room, startling all three. The scream was from Mrs. Chow. Mr. Chow hurriedly ran there first. As soon as he opened the door, he saw Mrs. Chow with one hand covering her eyes and the other hand pointing at something lying on a plate on the table. Mr. Pot tried to calm down. He probed into the room to see what that thing was. And he realized that the thing that made Mrs. Chow scream in such panic was the body of Mun, the black cat he had raised for 3 months. The corpse was covered in blood, its internal clothes were exposed, both eyes were exposed, and its body was crushed as if it had been run over by a car. Suddenly the phone rang loudly. Mr. Chow looked at the phone number that appeared and muttered. Brother Two, why did he call me so early? As soon as he picked up the phone, Mr. Kin's voice, Mr. Chow's brother, on the other end was choked. Pot, your nephew, T was run over by a truck. He died. Just a little bit. Mr. Chow could not keep his composure and collapsed. Mr. Chow then asked further. Where did it get hit, bro? Its body, is it intact? Mr. Kin replied bitterly. Near the house, right in front of the temple on the main road. I completely destroyed it, there was nothing left intact. Everyone heard it coldly. Ti's death was exactly like Mun's. As for Hung and I, we were even more scared because just last night, he and I were drinking and talking to Mr. T. Mr. Pot asked Hung to take the cat's body out to the garden to bury it. Mrs. Tao cleaned up the blood on the table, and he walked around the house, spreading ashes and mumbling something like a spell. After performing an autopsy and confirming that Mr. Ti's cause of death was purely an accident, the police returned the body so the family could take care of the funeral. As for Hung's family, a few days passed, not sure if it was because Mr. Chow had cast a pacifying spell or not, but life returned to normal, without any more ghostly phenomena. But I still have a hunch that things haven't stopped there. There are still countless unanswered questions in my mind. The image of the cat's corpse seemed to me like a threat, and Mr. Ti's death was just the beginning. Anyway, I still hope it's just because I'm thinking too much. At night, you and I come over and light incense sticks for Mr. T to listen to Tan. Tomorrow he will be buried. Wow. I just brought it back yesterday, but we'll bury it so quickly tomorrow? I asked in surprise. Hum replied. Yes, my uncle and I told T to leave quickly. But after struggling for several days, both the living and the dead are tired. Hung's voice was sad. It seemed like he was still shocked by his cousin's sudden death. As he spoke, he held a bag of fertilizer and poured it into the mango trees, while I stood watering. After finishing everything, he and I went to the car to go home. When they got home, after showering and eating, the two boys changed clothes, took the car and drove to Mr. Kin's house, Hung's uncle. Mr. Kin's house is located on a small but clean paved road, but strangely, the houses here are only built on one side of the road. The opposite side is land for planting trees, gardens, fields, shrimp squares, depending on what the landowner wants to do there. And for Mr. Kin's family, he likes to grow sugar cane. Right in front of his house is a very large sugarcane field of several dozen hectares, all of which belong to his family. Got out of the car and entered the house. It was almost 9 p.m. There were only a few guests left, welcoming two guys, Mr. Kin. Uncle Tu has only been a few days old and his hair is white, his face is so haggard. Hung looked at him and said words of comfort. It seemed like he had not slept for several nights. After burning incense and bowing, Hung walked closer to Mr. Kin and asked, "Where is Min?" Mr. Kin pointed to the house and said, "Just now, I saw that he was very tired, so I told him to go to sleep." Hung looked at him for a few seconds then said, "You look so pale. Well, you two should go to sleep tonight, and wake up early tomorrow morning to bury Mr. T. At this time, there probably won't be any more visitors. Tonight, my friend and I will stay awake for. Then I'm bothering you." After Mr. Kin finished speaking, he went straight into the house. Now I wonder. Hey Hung, why don't you close the coffin lid? Hung spread a mat close to the corner of the wall and said, "Uncle Tu said he died very suddenly, so if he remembers, he can climb up and take a look. My uncle loves tea the most in the family. I'm a little scared, so tonight Hung and I have to lie here and watch over an open coffin. You're relative, so don't be afraid. I'm very cold, Hung. I thought to myself but didn't say it out loud because I was afraid Hung would get angry. The sky began to sprinkle small raindrops. In front of the house there was only one guy left from the funeral band lying on a wooden board. Hung was also snoring, but who just eloquently announced just now. "Let him keep watch over Mr. Ti's coffin tonight for Mr. Kin," I muttered and sighed. There was an invisible fear that kept creeping into my mind, making it impossible for me to sleep. Occasionally, I looked at the coffin and imagined what Mr. Ti's body would look like inside. Listening to Hung's words, hundreds of stitches were needed for his body to be whole again. Just thinking about it makes me feel both sad and scared. Suddenly I felt goosebumps, my hair stood up, I felt like there was a pair of eyes staring at me. Then when I looked up at the top of the coffin, I was startled because there was a black cat sitting on top of it. It looked straight at me with blue eyes, bright like headlights. Before I could do anything, it bared its fangs and screamed at me, then jumped to the ground and ran out first. "Hung, Hung, wake up. Something happened." Hung was startled, rubbed his eyes and asked, "What's up?" I told him that a black cat had just jumped over Mr. Ti's box. As soon as he heard it, his eyes opened and he exchanged words. The two guys immediately ran to the front of the house, trying to see if the cat had left, but there was absolutely no sign of it anywhere. Suddenly, from Ti's coffin, there was a rustling sound, like the sound of fingernails scratching on wood. The two guys' faces were pale and they didn't dare turn around to look back. Then a cold hand from behind grabbed Hung's shoulder. The two boys turned around and saw a dark face, messy hair, and two red eyes looming right before their eyes. Hung and I screamed in panic. "Ignore my relatives, the devil invades me, ignore my neighbors." Immediately, two rough hands quickly grabbed my mouth and Hung's, accompanied by a long, shush sound. Two little grandfathers opened their mouths for their children. "Neighbors are cursing now. It's me, Min, it's not a ghost." Hung still seemed to be asleep at this time. He removed Min's hand and asked, "Min, why are you looking at me? Like Mr. T?" Mr. Min patted his head and shouted, "Do you have any other questions to ask? We must be siblings, right?" Hung scratched his head and laughed, then Min continued to ask, "What are you two standing here for?" I told Min about the black cat incident. After listening, he rubbed his chin and thought for a few seconds, then pondered. "That's strange, does anyone in this area have a black cat?" All three looked towards the coffin and waited for about 10 minutes without seeing any movement, then Mr. Min said, "Maybe the cat hadn't jumped over Ti's body just now. Okay, you two go home." Hearing Mr. Min talk about me and Hung also felt reassuring. After that, Hung didn't dare sleep anymore, he stayed up with me until morning. The next morning, Mr. T was buried in the land behind the house. Even though it was pouring rain at this time, the burial ceremony was still held on time. After finishing everything, Hung and I got in the car to say goodbye to Mr. Kin. Min also went home to take care of work at the shop, leaving him alone in the cold house. Mr. Kin sighed heavily. "I wonder if the workers have finished making the grave for T." He muttered, then closed the door and went into the room. Perhaps he was still tired after his son's funeral, so as soon as he laid down on the bed, he fell asleep. It was still raining outside and the sky was rotten. A very loud thunderclap startled Mr. Kin, accompanied by a rattling sound in front of the house. The sound was like the sound of several doors hitting each other. I remember locking all the doors, right? he thought. As soon as he walked out, the two doors of his house were indeed flung open, the wind and rain causing them to continuously bump into each other. It felt like something was wrong, but he still tried to reassure himself. I probably forgot to lock it when I closed it. The wind was so strong that it tore the door open. Then he went to close the door. This time he carefully hooked a lock just to be sure. After finishing, he went back to his room, but this time as soon as he lay down, the clicking sound rang out again. He quickly ran out and sure enough, the two doors were opened and the lock was on the ground. His heart was pounding like it was about to fall out. He frantically pulled the doors closed. Suddenly a rustling sound came from right behind him. It seemed like someone had just passed very quickly towards the back of the kitchen. Could it be that the house was robbed? Thought then he grabbed a piece of tree from the corner of the house and went behind the kitchen. There was a rustling sound as he got closer, then his eyes caught sight of someone rummaging through the refrigerator, their back turned to him. Mr. Kin saw this and shouted loudly, "Who is it? You dare to come into my house and steal?" Suddenly, the thief let out a soft moan, his body trembling. So cold, so hungry. Mr. Kin's face was now pale with fear, but he still tried to speak firmly. "Whose child are you, coming into my house to steal food? Come back here and I'll take a look." The thief was silent for a moment and then slowly stood up. On this side, Mr. Kin held the tree firmly and took a defensive stance. But the moment it turned to look at him, he was so scared that he dropped the log. Its face had hundreds of stitches, purple skin pieces were interwoven all over its body, its eyes were milky white, and its mouth was stuffed with raw fish meat. A little. It was extremely difficult for Mr. Kin to say a single word. His body was weak and he had no strength left. T looked at him with dull eyes. He walked towards him absent-mindedly, stretched out his shabby hands, turned away, and whispered, "Dad, I'm hungry, it's cold, please give me to eat." While loving, remembering, and fearing his son, Mr. Kin really didn't know what to do. He just stood there, until T just came close. Suddenly he grabbed his face, showing a scary smile. "Thank you, Dad. I don't know if there's a storm or not, but why is it raining so much now? The storm keeps roaring, and the gusts of wind want to fly both Hung and me away." A few trees on the side of the road were blown away by the wind and fell across the road. The two guys were afraid of an accident, so they turned around and went into a nearby house to hide from the rain. Lightning kept jerking, dark clouds covered the sky. It was only 8 or 9 a.m., but I thought it was 5 or 6 p.m. Hung clicked his tongue. "I don't know when this rain will stop." I also sighed. Even though the two guys were wearing raincoats, they were still soaking wet. Suddenly I looked out at the empty lot opposite. In the limited visibility of the heavy rain, I could still see something rising from the ground, looking like a human hand. I panicked and called Hung. "Look over there." Looking in the direction of my hand, Hung exclaimed, "Looks like a human hand." My 8-year-old's blood was rushing again, so I took Hung over there to see. When I arrived, the rain suddenly stopped, but what I was more interested in was what was in front of me, a human hand with only bones stuck firmly into the ground. Hung and I looked at each other and silently understood. One went to find a log, the other a rock, taking turns digging up that land. Perhaps God was trying to help us. The ground had softened a lot thanks to the heavy rain. Wherever we dug, the soil quickly flowed there. In less than 15 minutes, We were shocked to realize that what was lying about 1 meter deep in the ground was a white skeleton in a convulsed state, wrapped around a large plastic sheet and a number of broken amulets. Torn, but the thing that puzzled me and Hung the most was that this skeleton only had a body without a head. It seems like someone buried this body here a long time ago. Hung stood looking at the body, then suddenly turned around and shouted, "Tan, look at that, the temple." I was stunned when I saw the temple standing right across the street, next to Hung's car. Why is it here? Right at this moment, the sky suddenly turned black like the night of the 30th, the howling sound of the wind echoed everywhere, followed by a creaking sound coming from the hole. Parents, Hung and I jumped on our heels and ran as soon as we saw the skeleton move. It crawled slowly after us. Hung was so scared that he ran and screamed. He threw away the sandals he was wearing, and I threw away my raincoat to avoid getting in the way. There wasn't a drop of blood left on both of their faces. Hung said loudly, "Hurry up, the car is very close, just need to cross the road." Hung's voice fell silent, not a single voice came from me or him anymore. Because at this moment, the two guys' bodies were as if they had been hit with acupressure points in a historical movie, unable to move, unable to speak, the two of them stood frozen in the middle of the road. Glancing back, the skeleton was still slowly crawling towards us. Hung's face was sad, his eyes were red, I knew he was about to cry, I myself could only moan and not say a word. Suddenly, a light shone in front of them, blinding both of them. Those were two light bulbs of a truck, it was running towards us at very fast speed. "Stop, stop," I wanted to scream but couldn't. Hung's moaning voice became louder and louder, and tears streamed down my face. Then when the car was only a few meters away from us, I could clearly see the face of the person sitting in front of the steering wheel. His face clearly showed the coldness and evilness of Mr. Kin. I closed my eyes and waited for death to come. With me, then my body will fall out one piece at each corner, it will take a long time to collect it all. And then, hundreds of stitches will be done, and my body will be whole again, just like Mr. T.I.'s corpse. I know that right now, Hung is also having the same thoughts as me, our lives are only measured in seconds. Suddenly, I was surprised to see the truck pass by me and Hung, as if we were just two shadows. A scream rang out from behind. I glanced at it and was surprised to see that what the truck threw in was the skeleton from before. But it seems that now it is not simply a normal skeleton anymore, but is surrounded by a blurry image of a body. I vaguely realized that it was the headless body that had chased me and Hung before. The car and the skeleton then slowly disappeared, and Hung's and my bodies also began to return to normal. I escaped, Namo Ai de Buddha. I escaped again. I can return to my family again, hic. Hung clasped his hands and bowed in 4 directions and 8 directions right after he could move, praying continuously. I sat down on the ground, panting. The image just now is like a 5-dime movie I often watch at shopping malls, it's so realistic it's unbelievable. So it's as I guessed, everything hasn't stopped yet, Mr. T.I.'s death is just the beginning. Hung and I drove home, our hearts still filled with images of the skeleton, the truck, and the cold, evil face of Mr. Kin sitting behind the wheel as if he had deliberately killed someone. Somehow, Ms. Tram opened the door for us. She asked about Mr. T.I.'s burial, then told the 2 boys to go change their wet clothes, and then went to prepare dinner. After eating, I went back to my room. I didn't sleep all night. In the morning, I had a heart attack. Both guys were both mentally and physically tired. As soon as Hung laid down on the bed, he fell asleep like the dead, and my eyelids felt as heavy as lead. I tried to roll my eyes and look around one more time, following the feeling before it completely closed. I woke up with a start. My body felt heavy, my mind was drowsy. Looking out the window, the sky was completely dark. Outside there were crickets, bullfrogs, and frogs after the heavy rain. They were competing to sing, and listening to it made my heart ache. Suddenly my eyes stopped at the end of the garden, where yesterday Hung and I buried the body of Mun, his cat. I rubbed my eyes a few times, hoping I was mistaken. But no, after looking closely, I'm sure that land is now a hole, or to be more precise, it seems like someone dug up the cat's body, or maybe it rose from the grave. That thought scared me. Even though this wasn't the first time I encountered a demonic phenomenon, I couldn't stop my body from shaking. I risked my life and ran out to see, but it was exactly the same. The Mun's body had disappeared. There was only a little cat skin and fur left lying around, and there were faint cat footprints pointing towards the house. So scared, I ran in to call Hung, who was still snoring like a pig. Of course, how can I let him sleep peacefully while I'm so worried? Friends have to share in trouble. Hung, wake up quickly. I patted its face. Suddenly it jumped up like a spring, startling me. Eat. He spoke with his eyes still tightly closed, saliva running down his face. I gave it another blow to wake it up completely. Eat your head instead of eating it. Wake up, the Mun's body has disappeared. After hearing what I said, Hung immediately opened his eyes wide and exclaimed, "What?" Having said that, I took him to the back garden and showed him some cat footprints. Hung expressed doubts. Probably its body was carried away by something, but there's no way it could have been crushed by a car and come back to life. Right? I immediately objected. So explain to me, what are these cat footprints? Hung hummed. Well, probably stray cats. There are lots of stray cats and dogs down here. No problem. Go back to sleep. Hearing what Hung said made sense. I felt secure and went back into the room with him. At this time, Mr. Chow and Mrs. Tao had not yet returned, and Ms. Tram seemed to have fallen asleep. While I was dreaming, I felt something wrong inside me, indescribably uncomfortable, as if someone was looking at me. When I opened my eyes, I saw no one and the door was still closed. But there was a rustling sound like nails scratching on wood. It gave me goosebumps, my teeth were sore, and it was extremely itchy. Suddenly a window opened and hit the wall with a loud bang, making my heart jump. I opened my eyes and looked out, and oh my God, there was a black cat sitting in a pile on the window. It was even more terrifying when I realized that there was absolutely nothing under its belly, just a few ribs. Cracked, pierced through the skin. It looked at me without blinking, but even if it wanted to blink, it couldn't because its two eyes were almost protruding, almost wanting to fall out. I mumbled without making a sound. My foot kicked Hung repeatedly, causing him to roll several times and then fall to the ground. He struggled to sit up, his face grimacing from the pain of falling, his hand rubbing his ass. "You pedal so hard while sleeping, Grandpa." I turned to Hung, pointed to the window, and said breathlessly, "The cat, it really came back to life." Hung looked out the window, but now there was nothing there anymore. He looked at me with suspicious eyes, and I quickly explained. "Believe me, I really saw it." Hung immediately asked, So where is it now? A flash of lightning flashed across the sky, accompanied by a rumbling sound of thunder. Everything lit up for a second and then gradually sank into darkness. The lights in the house were all turned off. Power outage, huh? Hung only had time to say a word when from above, a few drops of water fell on his face. He used his hand to wipe the liquid and then brought it up to his nose and sniffed. What kind of water? Fishy. As soon as he finished speaking, something round and round fell like a ball next to Hung. He picked up that object, then turned on the flashlight and shined it on his phone. He wanted to pee in his pants when in his hand was Mr. Kin's head with two bloody eyes staring at him. He was so scared that he threw his head to the side and immediately jumped onto the bed and hugged me tightly. Although I was also very scared, suddenly there was a male guy sitting on the bed hugging me tightly. Actually, that feeling was equally chilling. I pushed it away while grimacing. Suddenly its face was close to mine. I could feel its hot breath blowing on my face with each soft voice. Shoo, silence, silence. He pulled me down, then quickly covered me with a blanket from head to toe. I suddenly realized why Hung did that. From outside the window, the hissing sound came very close, as if it came from somewhere in my ear. Outside the window, in the dim light of the moon, the girl's head has been there ever since. It floated in the air, flying around in the yard as if looking for something. The two guys lay huddled together, so tense that they couldn't breathe. Mr. Kin's head was still in the room, and before he had finished solving the problem, the other head came again. Mom, I want to go home with you. That was the only thought in my mind. I have never felt homesick like I do now. Suddenly the door of the room opened slowly. The creaking sound of the old hinges made a miserable sound. Hung, Tan, where are you two? It turned out to be Ms. Tram. Her face was dark and bright in the flickering light of the oil lamp she was holding in her hand. She signaled for silence, then waved her hand and whispered, "You two come out here, keep your voices down." As if we had met a savior, Hung and I were overjoyed and slowly crawled out the door, the head outside still not seeming to notice us. Having escaped outside, Miss Tram led us groping around in the dark. As we approached the door, a familiar voice said, "Hung, Tan, where are you two? Why is the house so dark? Why don't you turn on the lights?" "The power is out, sister too." Hung responded reflexively, but suddenly he remembered that he had been following his older sister. A current of electricity ran down their spines. The two guys stopped suddenly, their eyes glaring at Ms. Tram. Ms. Tram, who was walking in front, also turned around at this moment, her face showing surprise. "Why don't you two go anymore?" Almost out the door. In the flickering light of the oil lamp, I suddenly noticed the mirror placed on the wall where Ms. Tram was standing and was shocked to realize that she had no reflection. Hung also saw that. He stammered, "Hick, forgive us." Ms. Tram's face suddenly showed a distorted smile, and her crazy laughter echoed throughout the house. In the blink of an eye, that distorted face changed into that of Uncle though. The face is decomposing, the skin is ulcerated, pale, and the body is full of bones sticking out everywhere. I backed away in panic. Hung's face was not known whether he was crying or laughing. I only heard him sobbing and slowly crawling towards me. Mr. Though laughed so hard, then the sound of sobbing came from behind the garden. The crying and laughter mixed together made Hung and I feel like we were going crazy. We could only close our eyes and mouth and cover our ears to endure. At this moment, Miss Tram spoke up, seemingly not knowing what was going on. What are we playing that makes one cry and the other laugh? Why don't you turn on the light? It's too dark in your room. Hung heard that and shouted. What should I play? I'm afraid I'll pee. Stay in there, don't come out, you'll die. As he finished speaking, we heard a clicking sound like a door lock. Hung turned around, tears streaming down his face. My sister, my two sisters, she's so obedient. Suddenly Mr. Though looked at the two guys with mocking eyes and said, You sisters love each other so much, I will let them feel the pain of losing a loved one. The pain that I personally have to endure. Uncle Though slowly walked forward. Hung and I could only step back until there was no more room to retreat. He bared his yellow teeth as if joking, then stretched out his hands full of sharp bones, trying to grab us. Suddenly the door swung open, a flashlight shining straight in, blinding my eyes. Father. Hung's eyes filled with tears when he saw Mr. Chow. In his hand he held a string of beads and a few talismans. Looking back, Mr. Though's soul had also disappeared. Perhaps he was afraid of what Hung's three boys were holding. The two guys then told Mr. Chow all the terrible things they had encountered all day. After listening, his face was extremely tense. He asked the two guys to pack a few clothes and then went to the temple to take shelter. The next day, the house was so haunted by negative energy that it was impossible to continue living there. Mrs. Tao had already gone up there first, then he looked around and asked, Oh, where is your sister? Hung's face was sad and he replied, Yes, sister too is in the room, defending herself. Mr. Chow immediately ran back to Ms. Tram's room. He called out loudly, the door opened, and Ms. Tram appeared with a sleepy face. Hung saw that and immediately slapped his face. His voice was bitter. Oh my God, she's sleeping. Then he drove all three children out of the house, closed the door and sealed the house with a few talismans. Arriving at the temple, everyone was warmly welcomed by the monks. The monks took us into a large room enough for a whole family to stay. After cleaning up, because I couldn't sleep, I invited Hung to sit under the temple porch. Hung lit a cigarette and looked far into the distance in front of him. I've never seen him look so thoughtful. Here you can rest assured that you can sleep well, I said casually, as if trying to calm Hung's spirit, even though I was no better than him. Hung took a long drag of his cigarette and said thoughtfully, Is it possible to stay here all the time? This matter must be resolved completely. I still want to get married. I don't want to become a monk so soon. I looked at it and hesitated. I think your father knows the truth. You should ask him. Hung didn't say anything. He thought for a few seconds, then stood up and went inside. A few minutes later, he pulled Mr. Pot out into the yard and asked, Dad, you know what's going on, tell us clearly. But like this, my whole family can't live in peace. That's right, Uncle. I'll add more, just tell me, we'll help you solve anything. Perhaps Mr. Chow had also reached the limit of his tolerance. He sat down on the stone bench. The sound of the wind rustling through the leaves of the trees in the temple yard made the space even more gloomy. He said that 2 years ago, Mr. T knew a girl named Noyet. The two of them met on the full moon festival in August, the biggest full moon festival of the year in Kanjio district. They knew each other for a while, then Ms. Noyet got pregnant, but Mr. Kin and Mr. Ti's father criticized Ms. Noyet's family for being poor, so he chose another girl for Mr. T, whose family was one of the richest in the commune. Ms. Noyet asked Mr. T to try to convince Mr. Kin to accept the marriage, but the worst thing was that Mr. T himself denied the child, saying that he only wanted to meet Ms. Noyette on the street and not marry, saying he would only give up the child. Ms. Noyette refused to give up, just said that if Mr. T gave up, she would come to his house to cause trouble, or if necessary, she would go straight to the wedding to cause trouble. Mr. Kin, because his business was losing money, definitely did not agree. He really needed money to continue managing. He discussed with Mr. T that he would cause Ms. Noyette to miscarry. At that time, there would be no evidence to molest him anymore. After listening, Mr. T also agreed. They discussed a plan that Mr. T would invite Ms. Noyette home and let her drink only water mixed with abortion pills. After drinking, Ms. Noyette had a severe stomach ache. When she asked, she found out that Mr. T was cheating and just ran away into the street, but even Mr. T did not expect that Mr. Kin had other plans from before. As soon as Ms. Noyette stepped out, he was already sitting in the truck, and then the unexpected accident happened. As soon as Hung heard this, he cursed. "Mom, father, and son are so cruel." Then what next? He continued. Mr. T witnessed that incident and thought it was his fault, but things could no longer be saved. The two people discussed burying the body in an empty space near the Shrimp Square. Ms. Noyette died on the full moon day of August last year. At that time everyone rushed to celebrate. No one witnessed this. Hearing this, I was startled. The full moon festival in August this year is coming. Hung frowned in thought and wondered. Well, so does Uncle Tho have anything to do with that moon? Mr. Pot sighed. Mr. Tho is Noyette's biological father. He was hit by a car and died right where Noyette died. People felt guilty, so they brought his body back. The neighbors each contributed a little money to build him a grave near the hut where he was staying. I asked further. So, Uncle Tho, do you know that Ms. Noyette died? I don't know. Mr. Chow replied, maybe he knows or not, or maybe he dies and then he knows. Hung grimaced. Isn't that why he haunts my house? Everyone has to pay their debt. What does it have to do with our family? Mr. Chow looked at Hung. His voice seemed regretful. Yes, child. Dad knows a master who specializes in casting spirits in Vung Tao. It was my father who hired him to cast a spell on Noyette's soul, not allowing me to return to my house. Too, unintentionally, I couldn't escape, so I kept wandering around. Maybe that's why Mr. Tho hates his whole family. But at that time, she only thought that Uncle Tu's house was haunted, not knowing the truth that it was he who killed Noyette. He just told Dad the truth at Ti's funeral. Sigh. I suddenly remembered the skeleton found in an empty lot near Mr. Kin's house, so I asked. Did you wrap a plastic sheet around Noyette's body and then draw a charm on it? He remained silent instead of answering. After hearing that, Hung was speechless, so everything was clear. The task now is how to erase the hatred of Mr. Tho and Ms. Noyette, so that both of them can escape. The loud ringing of the phone broke the silence of the three. It was Mr. Chow's phone. He picked up the phone. Min's voice on the other end of the line exclaimed. Uncle 3, your dad, is dead, Uncle 3. His body is lying outside Ti's grave, all torn up by crows and kites. Sniff. Mr. Chow dropped his phone to the ground when he heard the bad news. T died before that, and Mr. Kin also died. So maybe the next person will be you. Mr. Chow was extremely confused when thinking about that scenario. Suddenly, I kept hearing a cracking sound above my head. I reflexively looked up and was frightened, and a tree branch the size of an adult's calf was about to break. I quickly shouted, "Stay away." Mr. Pot and Hung were stunned and didn't understand what was going on. The tree branch made another loud crackling sound and fell right where Hung and his son were. I immediately used all my strength to push them both aside just in time for the tree branch to fall and break the stone bench. Mr. Pot and Hung were shocked, their eyes opened wide, staring at the tree, their hearts beating loudly. They had just narrowly escaped death. It was clear that there was only a light breeze at this time, and if you looked closely, the tree branches were still green. How could there be a broken bone like that? Arrived. Mr. Chow could only utter two broken words. Hung looked at him worriedly. Could it really be his turn? "Dad, are you okay?" Hung looked all over his father's body. Mr. Chow waved his hand to try to appear calm. "Dad, it's okay." "What to do now, Dad? Uncle, those next revenge target is definitely you." Mr. Chow looked at Hung, thought for a few minutes, then turned back and said, "Now the only way is to dispel Noyet's spell. If her soul is freed, perhaps Mr. Tho will also ignore this matter. That's the only way." Saying that, he picked up the phone and called someone. "Who are you calling?" Hung wondered. "Uncle Nine Thoan," Mr. Chow answered intermittently. Mr. Thoan was Mr. Chow's friend and was also the person he asked to cover Ms. Noyet's body at that time. According to Mr. Chow, only the person casting the spell knows exactly how to dispel the spell as quickly as possible. After calling and calling several times, someone on the other end of the line picked up the phone. Suddenly I saw Mr. Chow's face turn pale. The phone in his hand was shaking as if it was about to fall to the ground again. His forehead was covered in sweat. He hung up, his face blank. I asked, "What's up, Uncle?" He sighed sadly. "Mr. Thoan is dead. He just died yesterday." Listening to what he said, Hung and I felt cold all over, so the last person who could help was gone. At this time, the wind in the yard began to blow strongly. The branches of the trees fell, clattering against each other, making creepy sounds. Suddenly his phone rang again, and Min's voice rang out on the other end of the line. "Uncle 3, come to my house quickly, I have something to tell you. Hurry up." Although he did not understand what Mr. Min meant, he had a hunch that something very important was going on. He looked at me and Hung and signaled, "You two go in and take the car out." "Where are you going, Dad?" Hung was confused. He replied succinctly, "Uncle Tu Kin's house." Looking at his eyes, Hung and I could only follow suit. Right now, only he could solve everything. There was a flash of lightning at the base of the clouds, accompanied by a rumbling sound of thunder. The two cars drove like flying in the dark night, and soon arrived in front of Mr. Kin's door. The house was dark without a single light. The door was locked from the outside. Perhaps the police had not yet received Mr. Min's body for the funeral without knowing the exact cause of death. Mr. Min stood there waiting. As soon as he saw us, he hurriedly ran back and said, "Uncle 3, your father just came home and reported a dream." Mr. Pot immediately asked, "What did your father say?" Mr. Min replied, "My father said he regretted killing Ms. Noyet, and also hired a magician to cast a spell on her soul, cutting off her head and body and burying her in two different places so her soul could not escape." As soon as I heard this, I quickly said, "I saw mine. It's true that it was enchanted and buried in an empty lot nearby." Mr. Chow looked at me, then looked at Mr. Min and asked, "So where is the head?" Mr. Min turned his eyes to the opposite sugarcane field and whispered, "Over there." Both me, Hung and Mr. Chow were startled. Unexpectedly, Mr. Kin would bury his crime right in front of his house. No wonder he planted sugarcane on such a large piece of land. Perhaps because of its denseness, it became an ideal place to bury bodies. "Show me your place." Mr. Chow spoke resolutely, then he picked up the shovel lying on the side of the house. All four people looked at each other and then went into the sugar cane field together. To be honest, after seeing ghosts so many times, being scared, and having my pants pulled down, I've gotten a lot harder, but this time the feeling is very different. It's different in that it's very dense here. Looking back and forth, it's all sugar cane. Even though it's almost the full moon today, the moon is very bright, but down here it's all deep black, with only one light coming from Mr. Min's flashlight. The rustling sound of the wind, the chirping of crickets, and the dim silver light of the moon create an extremely gloomy picture. Four people walked side by side in the sugarcane field. The sound of footsteps on the ground and dry sugarcane leaves kept blistering. A few minutes later, Hung suddenly stopped, causing me to slam into his back. I grimaced. "Why did you suddenly stop while walking?" Hung was sweating. He turned back to look at me and said, "Damn it, I'm lost." After hearing this, I immediately cursed angrily. "Oh my God, Dad, even though you're following behind your father, why do you still get lost?" The two guys looked around frantically, but saw no sign of Mr. Chow or Mr. Min anywhere. While he was feverish, Hung saw a shadow moving among the sugarcane trees in the distance. He called out loudly, "Dad, Dad, wait for us." "Are you sure it's him? Or is?" I asked him with suspicious eyes. He nodded vigorously and then said a green sentence. How could my father be confused? Looking at his slouching appearance, you immediately know him. Go quickly while he waits. He and I ran quickly to Mr. Chow, but we kept running but kept seeing his figure in front of us. We couldn't catch up even though the two guys ran and cried hoarsely. Running one more distance, he and I had to stop. "Why, Dad, you walk faster than I run," I said out of breath. Hung shook his head and replied, I don't know." While I was breathing heavily, suddenly a cold wind gently blew through my body. I shivered a few times, goosebumps all over my body. Hearing footsteps approaching, Hung immediately said, "He came back to pick me up." If that's true, then thank goodness, because as soon as Hung finished speaking, the sound of footsteps disappeared and the familiar whispers of conversation echoed again. Then from the sugar cane, a headless human body suddenly appeared, making my heart drop. I screamed in pain. "Pick up your grandmother, run quickly." I couldn't catch my breath and now I had to run again. I could only cry. Looking at Hung, I was even more miserable. His face was pale white, his eyes and nose were wet with tears, his mouth was yawning like a fish out of water. After running for a while, Hung suddenly fell face down on the ground. I immediately turned back to see if he was okay. Luckily, at that time we no longer saw that body chasing us. It seemed like we had already escaped from it. Hung's face grimaced, his hand kept touching his ankle. "I've dropped the ball, it seems like it's dislocated." I patted its head. "I bow to my grandfather, even if I run, I can't run anymore." "Then it came to you later." Hung's face was distorted and he snorted like a child. It's not my fault, there's some drunk grandfather lying in the middle of the road to trip me. Hung was right, there was a man lying face down blocking the middle of the road. He looked and cursed. Mom, I hate the most when you get drunk and then sleep on the street. Drinking is okay, but you have to know the way back. Then it turned to the man, shook him and shouted. Wake up, Grandpa, go home drunk, lie here and watch out for the wind, die. Hung's voice was interrupted because as soon as he turned the man around, he realized that it was his father, Mr. Pot. His face was covered in blood, you could see blood flowing down from the top of his head. The wound was so deep it was as if someone had hit him hard on the head with a very hard object. Tears streamed down Hung's face, he cried. Dad! Are you okay? Dad! I examined the wound, then put my hand on Mr. Chow's nose, then turned to reassure Hung. Don't yell anymore. Uncle Pot is still alive. Quickly take him to the hospital. Suddenly I saw something round and white on Mr. Chow's side. I picked it up and almost fell over. It was a skull. On the top of the head were 3 10-centimeter nails in the middle of the top of the head and the temples. Ms. Noyette's head. Hung uttered a sentence that everyone knew. I tremblingly picked up the head and tied it to my belt, then Hung and I each took one of Mr. Chai's hands and put it on our shoulders to carry it. Where did Min go? Hung asked as he walked. I could only shake my head. The most important thing now was to take Mr. Chow to the emergency room. Just after walking a few steps, the wind blew again, the trees pushed against each other. In the sound of the wind was a choking sound, and then a moan and a cry rushed straight into my ears. The strong wind seemed to want to hold us back, we couldn't really take even one step. The 2 guys were blown back by the wind. Mr. Pot's body rolled several times on the ground. A figure appeared, he stood with his back to us, towering in the moonlight. Looking at the figure, Hung said in bewilderment. Mr. Min. There was no answer, the surroundings suddenly became strangely silent, the sounds of crickets and wind were no longer there, the surrounding trees also stopped shaking, as if time had stopped. Suddenly a bolt of lightning flashed across the sky. In 1 second, Min's head turned 180 degrees, turning his bloodshot eyes and yellow teeth towards the 2 guys. Eyes glared at Mr. Chow, a hoarse voice hissed through gritted teeth. This guy has a long life, eating a shovel of mine won't kill him yet. At this point, I knew that person was not Mr. Min anymore, or rather, only the body belonged to him, and the soul belonged to Uncle Tho. Mr. Tho slowly approached. When he was close enough, I could see his ulcerated face, his crooked body and the foul smell. His hand was holding the shovel from before. I could clearly hear the purring sound coming from his throat. He looked at the 2 guys with blood-filled eyes and then slowly raised the shovel high. Run, run fast. That was the only thought in my head right now, but I couldn't. The body felt like it was being held back by some force. It was so weak and painful that it could no longer move. Hung now just sat looking at me with desperate eyes. He no longer had the strength to cry anymore. The sharp reflection of the shovel passed through my eyes. I could only see Mr. Tho aiming my head and swinging it down hard. Run! A voice rang in my head, causing my eyes to open. Looking up, I couldn't believe my eyes anymore. The shovel stopped just about 1 centimeter in front of my head. At this moment, Mr. Min's body was constantly shaking. I could see a blurry shadow, flickering like smoke, pulling Mr. Tho's soul out of Mr. Min's body. Min's body collapsed to the ground, motionless. Mr. Tho's face was now full of anger, his protruding teeth were full of sharp, gnashing teeth, very scary. The voice rang out again. Hurry up. Even though I didn't know who the soul was helping us, I turned to Hung and shouted, "Run!" He frantically stood up and carried Mr. Chow, forgetting that his leg was injured, while I carried Mr. Min. The two of us ran for our lives because we knew that if we didn't run now, we probably wouldn't have a chance to run again. Finally arriving at the two cars, Hung and I didn't have time to breathe. We immediately left Mr. Chow and Mr. Min behind the car and started pedaling. To be honest, I never thought I would be such a strong driver. One hand turned on the accelerator, the other hand held Min's body hanging behind me. The two guys ran straight to the district hospital at lightning speed. Behind was Mr. Those angry scream, but also full of sadness and resentment. The next morning, Min woke up. He shivered when he heard me tell him what happened last night. He almost became a murderer. As for Mr. Chow, he has also overcome the critical condition and is being cared for by Mrs. Tao. The abbot then asked an acquaintance, Mr. Sin, a skilled shaman in Dong Thap, to find the place where the remaining skeleton was buried and remove the amulet, or in the movie, unseal, both her head and body. Nor yet, then the monk chanted the Sutra of Transcendence day and night for guidance. As for Mr. Though, because of his accumulated hatred and the loss of 2 more lives, his guilt increased and he had to ask Master Sin to go to his grave, summon his soul, then seal his soul in a small ceramic jar with a leaf on it. He cast a talisman and placed it in the temple, hoping that one day he would let go of his hatred and escape. There is one particular thing that I find difficult to understand. Mr. Sin looked at me intently one day and said, "Women should no longer follow this man. Yin and Yang are separate, even though they are attached. They really cannot be together, so let me separate the two and then follow the abbot to study the Dharma, waiting for the day of reincarnation. Listen." He looked at me but looked like he was talking to someone. I asked, but he didn't answer. Seeing that, I stopped asking. Everything then returned to normal. Mr. Kin was assessed as having died of a heart attack and was returned to his family for a funeral. Hung's family also returned home to live. I plan to return to Saigon after the full moon festival in August. Going to Saigon tomorrow? Hung asked me while the two of us were watching the fireworks display. I looked at him and smiled and replied, "Yes, tomorrow. I miss home." Suddenly, Hung spoke loudly, his eyes still looking at the colorful flashing fireworks. "Thank you for listening, Cot Dot." I didn't say anything, just looked at it and smiled and continued to watch the fireworks. Suddenly my phone vibrated. I took it out and looked at the screen. It was Mrs. Hughes' number, Vi's mother, my girlfriend. I picked up the phone and slowly walked out of the festival area. On the other end of the line, Mrs. Hughes' voice was sad. "Are you bothering me?" I replied, "No, is there anything?" She was silent for a few seconds, then sobbed. "I planned not to tell you because Vi wouldn't let me, but I think you should know the truth so you don't blame her anymore. Vi is dead." I heard it and my heart wanted to stop beating. "Uncle, what do you say? I can't hear you clearly." She swallowed her tears and said, "Vi, she's dead." Then she told me that Vi wanted to break up with me when she found out she had leukemia 2 months ago. Knowing she was going to die and not wanting to tie me down, she said she had another lover, and even asked a colleague to pretend to be her boyfriend. Vi was in a coma for 2 weeks and just died the other day. Before she died, she told Mrs. Hugh to apologize to me and said she loved me very much. Early tomorrow morning is the day to bury her. After listening, my tears couldn't stop flowing. I decided to return to Saigon tonight so I could see her face one last time. I told Hung my story, ran home, gathered my things and headed towards the city. About 1 hour later, we arrived at Bangkok ferry. At this time the ferry had not yet passed. I was so nervous that I went to ask an elderly man standing nearby and was told that because today there was the annual full moon festival in Kinjio, so many people flocked here that the ferry had to run at full capacity. Currently down for maintenance, will be back up at about 5 a.m. tomorrow morning. I impatiently asked again, "Is there any way to get to the other side right away, or is there any boat or boat? I will pay no matter how much." The uncle looked at me for a moment and then said, "5 cents. Okay, I'll take my boat to take you." I nodded. Now that I had 1 million I would still go, let alone 500. My uncle asked me to wait for him to return home to take out the boat, when suddenly a voice rang out behind me. "Wow, it's my little brother again. Still healthy, right?" I looked back and it turned out to be the strange sister I met the first day I got off the ferry. I looked at her with annoyance and said, "What are you asking? I'm still healthy." She looked around me and asked, "So where is the girl who went with her brother last time?" This time I was really angry. I started to speak loudly. "Is this woman talking nonsense? That time I went alone, I didn't go with any girls." She looked at me for a moment longer, smiled mysteriously, apologized to me, then turned away. Just after taking a few steps, she called back, "Tell that girl to send her my regards. By the way, stay away from water. Goodbye, little brother." I really don't understand what she's saying. She's such a strange person. She talks without beginning or end. Just as I finished, I heard a call. I looked down the river and saw a boat coming. The uncle from before signaled, "Boy, let's go." I took the car down. The boat swayed a bit, maybe because it was a bit small, but it was still fine. Running for a while to reach the middle of the river, suddenly the wind blew very strongly. Waves from somewhere crashed into the side of the boat, causing it to wobble violently. The water flow seemed to be divided into two, flowing strongly and then merging together to form a vortex, as if preparing to swallow the boat. The uncle tried everything but could not make the boat escape the whirlpool. The water gradually flooded inside, seemingly about to sink. The uncle cried out loudly, "Careful, sit down. But, do you know how to swim?" Suddenly, the scene before my eyes lit up. The sky was clear and extremely beautiful. From above, Vi's silhouette slowly appeared. She reached out to me, smiling beautifully. Now I know, when I was in the sugarcane field, it was Vi who helped me escape being killed by Mr. Though, maybe many times before that. The uncle's voice rang out again, startling me back to reality. He shouted loudly. I asked, "Do you know how to swim?" I looked at him and smiled gently. "Are not.